Welcome back. We continue to follow this breaking news out of Washington, D.C. today. Former Vice President Dick Cheney has died at the age of 84. Cheney served as vice president alongside former President George W. Bush, but his political career stretched decades, making him one of the most recognizable and influential figures in politics. The Cheney family released a statement earlier this morning saying, quote, "The former vice president died from complications of pneumonia and cardiac and vascular disease." It went on to say, "We are grateful beyond measure for all Dick Cheney did for our country, and we are blessed beyond measure to have loved and been loved by this noble giant of a man." Presidential historian Alexis Coe joins me now for much more on Cheney's life and legacy. Alexis, thank you so much for your time. The former vice president spent much of his time in politics, so can you walk us through some of the moments in his career that define his legacy?
Absolutely. I mean, he has a long legacy. He was a chief of staff in the White House, but I think what we all remember him most for is his role as the vice president under George W. Bush. And certainly that's what I thought of this morning when I woke up. It was the first election I ever voted in, and now I'm a presidential historian. And so it's impossible for me not to see how Cheney really drastically changed the presidency, the vice president's role, and our standing in the international community.
Yeah, and Alexis, speaking of that, there are some out there who say, well, he was vice president, but then technically he was president because he had so much power. What is it about him that made him so controversial?
He is like radiation. You can still feel the effects. And what was very true about his vice presidency is that it was like none that came before it, and possibly arguably none that came after it. We have John Adams, the first vice president, saying that this is the most irrelevant post my country has ever conceived of. And that was true for quite some time until Cheney. He came in, he was a surprise. He was a chief of staff. He was an operator. He was very important in shaping the modern Republican Party alongside Newt Gingrich. And then we see him sort of almost as you said, technically Bush was president, but there was a parallel presidency going on. Bush would sign the orders, but Cheney was the architect. And so he had his hands in everything, and you really saw it as his vision that he was pushing forth. You understood that his background in the Defense Department, as a chief of staff, as a longtime operator, was informing everything that he was doing, and he was moving very fast, not unlike this administration, and often breaking things, sort of, not really apologizing later, but certainly not asking permission at the time.
Yeah. And how was Cheney able to wield his influence even when he left the White House?
This is interesting because he was still very much a kingmaker. So he was a strategist. He was embedded in the power makers of the Republican Party. And what's interesting is he was also very much with Trump. He understood that he was a powerful vehicle until the insurrection. And so we have the Cheney family then sort of really challenging a lot of America's conception of them during that time. But it wasn't to do with executive power. And I think that's really important to point out, that his greatest concern was about patriotic ideals, about the fundamental character of the nation. That's what he saw Trump threatening. And he didn't really see that as being an expansion or as an extension of his actions as the vice president.
All right. Alexis Coe, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you.